As the 1930s went on, it became very clear to FDR and other Americans that war with Europe and Germany specifically was going to be almost inevitable. As the 1930s progressed, we began to move away from our neutrality acts that prevented us from selling weapons to any nation at war to what was called a cash and carry policy. The cash and carry policy was very simple. First, it was only used for the Allies. That would be at this point Great Britain. These nations had to pay cash for the war materials that we were giving them and had to carry them on their own ships. This would prevent us from being dragged into the war by the materials being on our ships and then being sunk, which would then lead us into the war directly. Soon after this, what are called the Axis powers were formed. The Axis powers included Germany, Japan, and Italy. This is simply an alliance between these three nations. This is who the United States would then fight when we entered the war. FDR also realized that we would need to be building up our military. We began the selective service, which is the draft. This is going to be one of the first uses of the draft during peacetime. That means we weren't at war yet, but we were already building up our military. Roosevelt is also going to break precedent by seeking a third term in office. Up until this point, there had been no president that ever looked to get a third term in office. As most Americans did not want to change presidents with all of this turmoil going on in the world, they chose to elect him one more time. In his annual message to Congress, FDR is going to ask Congress to protect America's four freedoms: our freedom of speech, our freedom of worship, our freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Many of these were targeted at Germany, talking about all of these freedoms that were being taken away from the Europeans. Soon, because cash was very scarce during a wartime and wars are very expensive, we moved away from the cash and carry policy and began what was called the Lend-Lease policy. This was only again used to help our allies, or what were called the arsenal of democracy. This meant that the United States was only willing to lend or lease, basically turning our war materials over to the Allies. This was any nation whose defense was vital to the defense of the United States. That basically means that we were concerned that if Great Britain fell to the Germans, that Germany would then turn its attention towards the United States and seek to attack the United States. Very soon after this, we are going to sign the Atlantic Charter. This is an agreement between the United States and Great Britain, FDR and Winston Churchill, that was very close to Wilson's 14 points during World War I. This is going to very broadly lay out the war aims or goals, basically what we wanted the world to look like after this war was over. It did not take long for Hitler to make a very big mistake on the European front of war. The Battle of Britain, where Hitler was in Germany, were attacking Great Britain by bombing them, had stalled. There was no progress being made on that front. So in June of 1941, Germany attacks Russia. While Germany initially had a lot of success, this very quickly stalemated, meaning that Germany was not making any advances there either. The biggest problem for Germany is going to come in the form of the Russian winter. When the Russian winter sets in, it is colder than anything the Germans were expecting. They were simply not prepared for it. This is going to halt Germany in its tracks. And while the Russian winter is also hard on Russians, it was not nearly as bad as it was for the Germans. Now the war is on two fronts. This is going to make Germany substantially weaker in that their forces are now split and having to fight in various locations instead of being focused in one area. We will come back and talk about this particular invasion of Russia later. So the question is, why does the United States enter this war? We already had an embargo on Japan because of their very aggressive actions in the Pacific. Remember, we were attempting to keep them from being aggressive and taking other nations over without going to war. So what we did was we placed an embargo on them. An embargo is where we refuse to trade oil with them. In this case, it's an oil embargo. An embargo can be an embargo on many other products as well, but in this case, it was oil. And oil was very valuable to the Japanese. The United States was very aware that the Japanese were quite possibly planning an attack. We weren't sure where this attack might be, but we were very aware that something might be coming. All the while, we were attempting to plan a peace and to maintain peace with Japan. Unfortunately, on Sunday, December 7th, 1941, is the day that Japan surprise attacked Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. This was the day that will live in infamy. This particular quote came from when FDR addressed Congress, in which he asked Congress for a declaration of war on Japan for that attack on our soldiers in Pearl Harbor. Once we declared war on Japan, Germany then declared war on the United States, followed by Italy. The United States is now in World War II. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, many Americans were furious. Many millions volunteered for service, and millions more were drafted under the Selective Service Act. These soldiers, or GIs, only went to basic training for 8 weeks, 2 months. If you remember, soldiers in World War I trained for 9 months before shipping out. We were getting these soldiers ready very quickly. We also had women serve in various capacities. Thousands of women volunteered for the Women's Auxiliary Corps, which is basically the women's branch of the U.S. Army. Women served when in non-combat positions. For example, they would do office work, drive ambulances, serve as nurses or cooks. And this particular branch, there was also one for the Navy, they were the Waves, and the Women's Auxiliary Corps was often called the WACs. Other minorities also served in segregated units, so they were separated from other American soldiers. The Tuskegee Airmen are one of the most well known, and they were African American pilots who served during World War II. Other minorities who also served with distinction were the Navajo. This was the Native American group that served as code talkers. It was very effective because while other codes were just made up codes, the Navajo were actually speaking their native language. This was the only code that was never broken by the Germans during World War II. Life on the home front for the Americans is going to be very different. First of all, we had the War Production Board. This is going to be the group, the government agency that was responsible for changing America into a war materials producer. This is the group that goes in and tells various industries what product they will be making. As you see in this picture, here is a plant making airplanes. Scientists were also called into action. They came up with various new technologies like radar, sonar, medical technologies like penicillin. We are also going to explore the use of the atomic bomb, which we will look at later. Women also stepped into many war materials jobs. Jobs that were typically held by men were now had to be filled by women because men were serving in the military. Rosie the Riveter, who you see in this poster on the right, came to represent the effort of many women during World War II to help support the war effort. We also see the entertainment industry come and help with the war effort as well. Basically, they supported the war effort. They are going to encourage many Americans through lots of propaganda, through newsreels, encouraging many Americans to support the war effort going on. Just like in all previous wars, when the United States enters World War II, we will see the size and scope of the American government increase in an effort to control the war effort in this war. Because many supplies were limited, we are going to see a rise in prices that is called inflation. So the American government steps in and controls those rising prices by putting price freezes on those. We are also going to ration many products in order to conserve our resources. A ration is just where every product was limited. Products like tires, gasoline, various food products, clothing products, all of these were limited in an effort to conserve our resources for our soldiers. We also had to pay for this war somehow. In this case, we're going to pay for the war in two ways. The first were income taxes. We see income taxes increase, which is going to be every citizen paying more every year in the form of taxes. We are also going to see many citizens support the war effort through war bonds. Remember, this is a way that a citizen is going to give the federal government money. It's like a loan. They give the government money, and the government pays them back with interest. The fact that so many Americans were willing to give this money and buy war bonds demonstrated that the American people supported this war. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, many Americans were very concerned about Japanese Americans who were living here in the United States. In order to deal with this possible threat, the United States is going to put Japanese Americans into prison camps after the attack on Pearl Harbor. This particular act is going to be questioned by the court case Korematsu versus the United States. This discriminatory action was questioned about whether or not it was constitutional. In this court case, the American government ruled that it was okay to put those Japanese Americans in the internment camps because of issues of national security. And we will look more closely at those issues as we look at the documents and the reasons the American government gave for putting these Japanese Americans in those camps.